When you think about constructing a custom home, the whole process is, well, it's incredibly linear, right?
Yeah.
And super unforgiving.
Oh, absolutely. Very unforgiving.
Yeah, like you survey the land, you pour the concrete foundation, you frame the walls, and then, months later you move the furniture in.
Right.
But the thing is, if there is a subtle, invisible crack in that initial concrete pour, you don't really get to just ignore it later on.
No, you definitely don't.
Every single load-bearing wall, every door frame that suddenly won't shut properly down the line,
Yeah.
the entire structural integrity of the house basically has to permanently compensate for that initial flawed pour.
Yeah, because the foundation dictates the entire lifespan and the behavior of the structure above it. I mean, you can remodel the kitchen, right? You can paint the walls whatever color you want to give the illusion of change, but at the end of the day, you are still perpetually living on top of that early concrete.
Exactly. But, okay, what if we applied that architectural blueprint analogy directly to you, to the listener tuning in right now?
That's where it gets interesting.
Right. What if the foundational architecture of your entire adult life, like how you handle your finances, who you fall in love with, your deepest sense of personal identity, what if all of that was poured and set in stone before you could even tie your own shoes?
Which is a wild thought.
It is, before you had any conscious say in the design whatsoever.
And it's a profoundly unsettling thought, I think, because it strikes right at the heart of how we view ourselves as individuals.
Yeah, it really challenges our whole modern conception of free will, doesn't it?
It does. It challenges adult agency. We deeply, deeply prefer to think of ourselves as these self-made, independent operators, people who make logical choices based on our current reality, not our past.
Right. We like to think we're in the driver's seat. Well, today, we are going to actively challenge that comfort zone. Welcome to Today in the Hypothesis.
It's great to be here.
So glad to have you. Our mission for this exploration is to really pull apart a deeply provocative question. Are human adults essentially just children who have learned to fend for themselves?
It's a heavy question.
It really is. Are you actually running on your own original adult-coded software? Or are you just blindly executing a survival script that was written for you when you were 3 years old?
And to investigate this, we are examining a really comprehensive and just utterly fascinating document by independent researcher Victor H. Sertouche.
Yeah.
It's titled The Neotenous Architecture of the Human Life Course. And what makes this examination so compelling is that it synthesizes evolutionary biology, neurobiology, and developmental psychology all together.
This huge scope.
It is. It builds the staggering case that we are physically and psychologically tethered to our earliest developmental stages in ways we barely even comprehend.
And I think if we're going to understand why our childhoods hold so much deterministic, invisible power over our daily adult lives, we can't just start with modern psychology, right?
No, you really have to go back further.
You actually have to rewind the clock millions of years. We have to look at how evolution intentionally designed the human animal to be, well, completely unfinished.
Yeah, human evolution is characterized by a radical, almost counterintuitive shift in developmental timing.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
So in evolutionary biology, there is a core concept called heterochrony. This describes what happens when the timing or the rate of developmental events changes in a descendant species compared to its ancestors.
Got it.
And humans took a very specific, highly unusual path within heterochrony known as neoteny.
Okay, so neoteny, that basically means the retention of juvenile traits into adulthood, right?
You get it.
Like, we essentially just refuse to grow up, biologically speaking.
Exactly. Unlike other primates, humans achieve sexual maturation and full reproductive adulthood while physically and behaviorally remaining very much like the juvenile stages of ancestral ape species.
Wow.
We are, in a strict literal biological sense, born unfinished, and we stay that way our entire lives.
Let's make this tangible for the listener, because the physical evidence for this is everywhere once you look for it, but you'd never notice it until someone points it out.
Yeah, it's hiding in plain sight.
Right. Like, if you compare a human adult to a non-human primate adult, we look remarkably like their babies.
We really do.
We keep this globular, relatively thin-boned, bulbous skull. We have what the literature calls a flat orthographic facial profile.
Right, which simply means our faces stay flat and vertical.
Okay.
We don't develop that protruding, elongated snout, the prognathic face that you'd see in a mature chimpanzee or a gorilla.
Even the way our heads sit on our necks is a retained baby trait, isn't it?
Yes. the foramen magnum.
That's the hole at the base of the skull where your spinal cord enters, right?
Exactly. It stays positioned, tucked right under the center of our skull, just like an infant ape. In adult apes, as their heavy jaws grow, that hole actually shifts toward the back of a skull just to support the weight.
But ours never moves.
Ours never moves. And that physical retention of juvenile traits isn't just a quirky anatomical coincidence. It is the exact mechanical engine that allowed us to become human in the first place.
It's wild to think about.
There is a pivotal evolutionary trade-off at play here, and it centers around one specific genetic mutation that altered our jaw muscles.
The MYH16 gene. This is where the biological mechanics get incredibly cool. We basically traded bite force for brain space.
That is the exact transaction.
So cool.
The MYH16 gene mutation led to a significant permanent reduction in jaw muscle size in the early human lineage. If you look at our primate cousins like gorillas or chimpanzees, they possess massive, incredibly powerful masticatory muscles for chewing tough, raw vegetation all day long.
Right, muscles that are so thick and powerful, they literally require extra ridges of bone on the top of the skull just to anchor them down.
Exactly, the sagittal crest. And those massive muscles exert incredible mechanical pressure on the skull itself.
Oh, I see.
Because of that constant crushing pressure, the cranial sutures, those are the flexible fiber spans of tissue connecting the various bone plates of the skull they have to fuse entirely and very early in life to provide a solid, rigid defensive structure.
So they don't get crushed by their own chewing.
Right. But early fusion comes with a massive penalty.
Which is?
Once the skull turns into a solid helmet, it cannot expand anymore. It permanently traps the brain at a certain volume.
Oh, wow. So by mutating to have these weak, relatively pathetic juvenile ape jaw muscles, our human ancestors suddenly didn't have that immense mechanical pressure squeezing the skull together.
Yes, the plates didn't have to lock into a helmet.
So retaining that weak jaw allowed the human cranium to remain soft, flexible, and unfused for a much, much longer duration after birth.
And that extended flexibility is what permitted dramatic encephalization, the massive, explosive expansion of the cerebral cortex that wholly defines our genus, Homo.
But the cost of building that giant energy-hungry brain is steep. Right?
Right.
Because our heads got so massive, evolutionary speaking, we had to be born earlier and earlier just to physically survive the birth canal.
We did. It's the obstetrical dilemma.
Right. Human babies are born with brains that are only about 25 to 30% of their final adult size.
Which is incredibly small compared to other animals.
Yeah. Other primates are born with brains already at 40 to 70% of their adult capacity. We were born so ridiculously early in our developmental trajectory that we are basically still fetuses for the first year of life outside the womb.
Which brings us to the social brain hypothesis.
Okay, let's unpack that.
This biological delay, the state of physical neoteny, isn't just about fitting a big head through a narrow space. The hypothesis posits that the unusual size of our brain evolved specifically to manage the sheer, overwhelming complexity of human social living.
So we require what the researchers call a luxuriously slow development.
Luxuriously slow. I love that phrase.
It's great. We stay completely helpless for years, retaining an intense plasticity of behavior that other animals only experience for a few fleeting weeks.
Right.
And the reason for this is cultural download, basically. This massive window of helplessness gives our caregivers the necessary time to literally upload culture into our open architecture.
And culture is basically a massive suite of non-physical survival adaptations passed down across generations.
Right.
Evolutionary theorists heavily argue that this retardation of maturity is the primary determinant of human evolution. We absolutely require a decade or more of total dependency just to acquire complex language, executive function, and the intricate social regulation necessary to not get, exiled from a human tribe.
Okay, but I have to grapple with the underlying logic of this, though.
Sure.
Evolutionary speaking, being unfinished seems like a massive, almost reckless gamble.
It does.
Right. Out in the ancestral wild, if your offspring is physically vulnerable, loud, and utterly helpless for a decade, that is a giant liability. They're essentially just predator bait for 10 straight years. How did that fragile strategy outcompete animals born ready to run on day one?
It is perhaps the greatest paradox of our species.
Yeah.
The evolutionary calculus clearly demonstrated that the eventual payoff, a highly adaptable, hypersocial, problem-solving adult brain that could invent tools and coordinate group hunting, was worth the temporary, decade-long vulnerability.
A long game.
Exactly. But grappling with that paradox highlights the core tension of everything we are discussing today. This evolutionary gamble means that our developing brain, because it is born so unfinished, is entirely at the mercy of its early environment.
Right.
It cannot survive, let alone develop properly, without intense, sustained external support.
Because the actual physical construction of the human brain is happening after we are born, while we are completely exposed to the elements, the culture, and the caregivers around us.
Yes.
We aren't building the house in a controlled factory. We're building it in the middle of a hurricane.
That's a perfect way to visualize it.
Let's zoom in on that critical window of construction, because the mechanics of how the brain builds itself are wild.
They really are. And the scientific consensus points to the first 1,000 days, from the moment of conception to roughly age 2.
During this 1,000-day window, the brain is described as experience expectant. I find that phrasing so haunting.
It's very precise.
It means the brain isn't just passively swelling in size, it's actively, hungrily waiting for specific environmental inputs to tell it how to wire itself for the specific world it has been born into.
Right.
It's like we poured the concrete foundation, and the house is actively demanding shipments of steel, wood, and electrical wiring to finish the internal walls. And if those specific shipments don't arrive on time, the house just walls off those sections and builds a smaller, weaker structure.
That captures the urgency perfectly.
Yeah.
During these first 1,000 days, the brain is undergoing rapid synaptogenesis.
Which is what exactly?
It's the explosive, almost chaotic creation of electrical connections between neurons. And alongside that, myelination.
Okay.
Myelination is the process of wrapping insulation around those neural pathways to make electrical communication faster and more efficient. And those supply shipments you mentioned, they are the literal physical nutrients the infant ingests. The nutritional determinism at this stage is staggering.
We really need to look at the mechanism of this, not just the outcome. Take iron, for example.
Oh.
The infant brain expects a steady shipment of iron to facilitate that myelination process you just mentioned. Iron is basically the raw material needed to manufacture the electrical tape that wraps around the brain's wiring.
Right.
So if a child's diet lacks iron during this sensitive period, the wiring remains uninsulated, the electrical signals short-circuit, and the result is permanently impaired motor skills and altered social behavior that persists way into adulthood.
And then consider zinc. The brain utilizes zinc as a fundamental building block for DNA synthesis and cell proliferation.
Oh, wow.
So a deficiency in those early days physically restricts the sheer number of brain cells that can be manufactured. You end up with a smaller cellular workforce, resulting in severely reduced cognitive flexibility and poor memory retention years down the line.
And what about just basic protein and energy intake? I mean, we aren't just talking about complex vitamins here. We are talking about calories.
Exactly, just basic caloric scaffolding.
A lack of that basic scaffolding in infancy dictates the overall volume and structural integrity of the brain. An energy-deficient environment correlates directly with lower IQ scores and markedly reduced occupational success in adult life. Think about that for a second. We are talking about your ultimate career trajectory, your earning potential at age 40, being heavily influenced by what was sitting in your childhood pantry when you were 9 months old.
It's chilling when you put it like that. We also must factor in long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs.
Okay, what do those do?
These are critical for membrane fluidity and visual processing circuits. An early deficiency here is heavily linked to ADHD-like symptoms and permanently reduced cognitive processing speed in adults.
Wow.
But what is truly crucial to understand about this biological construction phase is the strict timing of these insults.
Right, because different wings of the house are under construction at different times. You can't just pause the build and wait for materials.
Precisely. The brain builds on a strict biological schedule. If nutritional insult or deficiency happens very early, perhaps in utero or immediately post-birth, it disproportionately damages the hippocampus.
The memory center.
Right. The region governing memory and learning, because that is the area currently under heavy construction. But if the nutritional insult happens slightly later, say during the first 6 postnatal months, it severely compromises the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, which handles executive function, impulse control, and complex decision-making.
So missing the exact same building materials at month 2 versus month 6 leaves the adult with entirely different structural vulnerabilities.
Completely different. And this structural imbalance in neural circuits doesn't just lower an IQ score a few points, it creates deep fault lines.
Yeah.
The research indicates that these early disruptions increase the underlying vulnerability to major psychiatric disorders, including schizophrenia, much later in life, You cannot simply go back and rewire a foundational structure once that sensitive 1,000-day period has firmly closed.
If you run out of electrical tape in year 1, you can't just crack open the walls and slap it on in year 20. The drywall is already up.
The structural integrity is set.
But, we aren't just digesting physical nutrients like zinc and iron during those first 1,000 days.
No, we are.
We are absorbing the emotional environment just as heavily. The emotional temperature of the home acts as a literal neurobiological input. So if the brain is experience expectant, what happens when the experience it gets is overwhelmingly toxic.
This brings us to the profound lifelong impact of early life adversity, or ELA, and adverse childhood experiences, commonly known in the medical field as ACEs.
Right?
If the infant brain is expecting safety, nourishment, and responsive care to build higher-order cognitive functions, then severe stress, neglect, or abuse represents a fundamental violation of the expectable environment.
Wow. A violation of the expectable environment.
When the brain receives chronic threat signals instead of safety signals, it ruthlessly alters its construction priorities.
It abandons the plan to build a curious learning machine, and it diverts all resources to building a paranoid survival machine.
That is the biological imperative. And the primary mechanism for this drastic shift in architecture is the dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
The HPA axis.
Yes, this is the body's central stress response system. Under states of toxic stress, where stress hormones like cortisol are constantly flooding the developing brain, the delicate neural circuits are corroded.
Corroded. That's a strong word.
It's accurate, though. It particularly damages the vital connection between the amygdala, which acts as the brain's raw fear and emotion center, and the prefrontal cortex, the logical regulatory center we just discussed.
Let's paint a picture of a neurotypical trajectory versus a toxic stress trajectory, because the contrast is wild.
Okay, let's do it.
In a typical safe environment, as a child grows, their prefrontal cortex matures and starts to act like a heavy brake pedal for the amygdala. It provides top-down inhibition. Say you are walking down the street and a car backfires loudly. Your amygdala instantly spikes, it screams, "Gunshot, run!" But a fraction of a second later, your healthy prefrontal cortex assesses the context, realizes it was just an old truck, and slams on the brakes.
You exhale. You calm down quickly.
Exactly.
That represents healthy emotional regulation, a natural expected decline in impulsive emotionality as the brain matures. But early adversity physically disrupts the wiring of that brake pedal.
It breaks the brakes.
It does. In a toxic stress trajectory, the constant flood of early cortisol means the amygdala becomes hyper-responsive, enlarged, and constantly twitchy, while the prefrontal cortex fails to establish strong, dense inhibitory connections.
So the fire alarm is deafening, and someone cut the wire to the off switch.
Which fundamentally traps the adult in a state of constant, exhausting high alert, a physiological state known as hypervigilance. The document details a fascinating, deeply tragic concept here called voice calculus.
Oh, I found the voice calculus concept entirely shifting how I view interactions.
It's incredibly revealing.
Adults who experienced high levels of early life adversity have nervous systems that are intensely calibrated to detect threats, even in perfectly safe, mundane environments.
Right.
They constantly subconsciously run a voice calculus. They are intensely analyzing the subtle tone, pitch, cadence, and microexpressions of the people around them.
Imagine an office environment, right?
Yeah.
A manager walks in, sighs heavily because they had a rough commute, and says, "Let's just get through this meeting."
Okay.
An employee with a secure background barely registers the sigh. An employee running a toxic stress blueprint instantly calculates that sigh as an impending, dangerous emotional explosion.
Their heart rate spikes.
Their cortisol floods, and they instinctively shift toward extreme caution, fawning, or defensive behavior.
But how does an adult untangle that? I mean, if your internal alarm system is permanently stuck on maximum sensitivity because of how your literal brain tissue was formed before you were 3 years old, how does an adult ever tell the difference between a real, current threat and an echoing ghost from their childhood?
It's a huge challenge.
Are you just biologically doomed to be an anxious, reactive person forever?
They are not biologically doomed, but we must acknowledge they are heavily biologically burdened. The path of least resistance, the default neural highway, is anxiety and threat detection.
Right.
Overcoming it requires massive conscious cognitive effort, which is metabolically exhausting. The hypervigilance is a feature, not a bug, of their specific developmental environment.
Kept them alive.
Yes. Their brains successfully adapted to survive a dangerous, unpredictable childhood. The tragedy is that those brilliant adaptations are horribly maladaptive in a safe, collaborative adulthood.
Your body is basically wearing a suit of armor to a dinner party.
Precisely.
And this internal alarm system doesn't just dictate your internal peace. It becomes the exact blueprint for how you let other human beings into your life. It dictates your most intimate adult relationships.
It really does.
If the biological structures are the hardware, we are now moving into the software of attachment theory.
Attachment models operate as the fundamental operating system of human connection. Attachment theory posits that the quality of the bond between an infant and their primary caregiver establishes an internal working model.
Okay, an internal working model.
This is a deeply subconscious, embedded template that dictates how you expect to be treated, how much you trust others, and how you behave in close relationships for the rest of your life.
The sheer scale of the data backing this up is mind-bending. We're looking at a rigorous 30-year longitudinal study in the sources.
It's an incredible study.
They literally tracked 705 participants from the time they were infants all the way up to age 30. And they found that early interpersonal experiences lay the absolute, undeniable foundation for adult functioning.
It is worth breaking down the specific predictive values from the study just to understand the magnitude.
Let's do it.
In statistics, an R-squared value tells us the percentage of variance in an adult outcome that can be reliably mathematically explained by a specific childhood predictor.
Okay, let's contextualize this for a second, because human behavior is influenced by millions of variables over 30 years. You know, where you went to school, your first heartbreak, the economy.
Thousands of variables.
So finding a single infant variable that predicts adult behavior 3 decades later is like finding a single line of code that controls a massive chunk of your entire operating system.
Exactly. For general adult attachment, the early mother-child relationship quality predicts a median of 3% of the variance.
Which is significant over 30 years.
Very. Specifically, it predicts 2% of adult attachment anxiety and a massive 9% of avoidance in adult romantic relationships.
Wow. In the complex realm of developmental psychology, a single infant variable reliably predicting nearly 10% of adult romantic avoidance 30 years later is staggering.
It really is. It means if your early caregiver was consistently dismissive or emotionally unavailable, you carry a highly measurable, statistically significant urge to push romantic partners away 3 decades later.
That's wild.
But the data reveals something else equally critical, shattering the illusion that it's all just about the mother.
Early friendship quality.
Yes.
The quality of your early childhood friendships, like how you navigated the playground, significantly predicts your adult peer and friendship relationships.
It predicts 4% of adult friendship anxiety and 10 to 11% of adult friendship avoidance.
We all know that one guy at the office who treats a simple team lunch or a collaborative project like a high-stakes hostage negotiation.
Oh, absolutely.
He refuses to delegate, he doesn't trust anyone, and he keeps everyone at arm's length. It turns out we probably just need to look at how he was treated on the swing set at age 6.
It clearly indicates that while primary caregivers provide the foundational template for basic safety, our earliest interactions with peers serve as the crucial training ground for navigating horizontal intimacy.
Horizontal intimacy. So, how we deal with equals.
Exactly. Individuals with secure attachment styles, those whose caregivers were responsive and whose early peers were safe, they grow up to experience markedly higher marital satisfaction, higher self-esteem, and highly effective emotion regulation.
But if you didn't get that responsive caregiving, or your early peers were cruel, you end up with an insecure style manifesting as either highly anxious or highly avoidant.
Right, and the researchers highlight the deeply recursive, self-destructive nature of insecure attachment in adulthood.
You essentially build the exact prison you're afraid of.
These insecure attachment styles often manifest in adulthood as behaviors that seem irrational, puzzling, or entirely self-destructive to outside observers, but they make perfect logical sense when viewed through the lens of early childhood survival.
Let's put a human face on this. An adult running an anxious attachment blueprint might become intensely, overwhelmingly fixated on their partner.
Right. They might use guilt trips, constant texting, or controlling tactics just to maintain a feeling of closeness.
On the flip side, an adult running an avoidant dismissive blueprint will actively shy away from intimacy. The moment a partner gets too close or expresses need, they pull away.
Because they view any kind of emotional dependency as a literal existential threat to their autonomy. What is absolutely vital to internalize is that these are not personality flaws or moral failings. They are brilliant, necessary survival strategies that have simply outlived their usefulness.
Because in a childhood where caregiving was inconsistently responsive, the child had to develop a strategy.
Exactly. The anxious child learned that crying louder, throwing tantrums, and clinging tighter was the only possible way to occasionally get their unpredictable needs met.
And the avoidant child.
Facing constant emotional rejection, they learned that suppressing their needs entirely and relying solely on themselves was the only way to avoid the crushing pain of hoping for comfort and not getting it.
It's like learning a complex game with the entirely wrong set of rules.
How so?
It's like you were taught to play chess, but your instructor convinced you that your king is always under attack, from every single angle, right from the opening move.
Oh, that's a brilliant analogy.
When you sit down to play the game of a romantic partnership 20 years later, you're playing a completely different, infinitely more stressful game than your partner is. They're calmly trying to build a strong center and develop their pieces, and you are frantically sacrificing all your pieces just to build a massive, impenetrable wall around your king.
That analogy perfectly captures the friction of adult relationships. You are rarely dealing with the current reality. You are essentially dealing with the violent collision of two different childhood blueprints.
Right.
And the tragic irony is that these early learned survival strategies, when misapplied to adult partnerships, often create the exact rejection or suffocation the person is terrified of.
A self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes. The anxious person clings so tightly they suffocate their partner into leaving. The avoidant person pushes away so hard they end up entirely alone.
The blueprint dictates the structure, even when it destroys the house.
Exactly.
But, these survival strategies don't just affect who we date, who we marry, or how we befriend people. They directly infiltrate how we navigate risk, reward, and pure survival in the professional and financial world.
They do.
Which transitions us perfectly to the economics of childhood. If this biological alarm system dictates who we trust in our personal lives, it absolutely wreaks havoc on how we navigate trust and ambition in our professional lives.
The impact of childhood upbringing extends very deeply into socioeconomic determinism. A person's childhood socioeconomic status, their SES, acts as a profoundly powerful, invisible predictor of their adult financial behavior.
Okay.
It predicts their baseline risk tolerance and even their feeling of psychological safety in the workplace.
The psychological concept that really anchors this economic behavior is temporal discounting.
Right.
This is the preference for an immediate smaller reward over a delayed larger one. It's the classic, I'll take $10 right now instead of $20 next week.
And adults who experienced lower childhood SES show a significantly steeper preference for immediate rewards.
The scale of the research backing this is massive. A study involving nearly 13,000 adults across 61 countries demonstrated that those from lower SES backgrounds exhibited much steeper temporal discounting.
And crucially, this behavior was drastically exacerbated when they were faced with contemporary acute economic stress, such as the COVID-19 pandemic.
Interesting.
When modern stress hits, the adult brain bypasses logic and defaults heavily to the childhood blueprint.
Think about your own bank account right now and your own anxiety about the future. Society usually frames this behavior as a moral failure of adult self-control.
Right. Oh, they just lack financial discipline. They can't save.
Exactly. But the data forces us to reframe this completely. If you find yourself unable to save for retirement, or you compulsively spend money the second it hits your checking account, the data suggests you aren't lacking willpower. Your brain might literally be running a scarcity script from 1995.
We have to view temporal discounting not as a cognitive failure or a lack of intelligence, but as a highly rational biological adaptation to a scarcity mindset.
Rational. How?
Well, if you grew up in an environment where resources were highly unreliable, where a promised future reward, like a new pair of shoes, a stable meal, or a promised weekend trip, frequently failed to materialize because the money ran out.
Then the logic of take whatever you can get right now becomes biologically and psychologically embedded.
Yes, because waiting is an active threat.
If your childhood environment is unstable, the delayed reward might vanish entirely. In adulthood, this manifests as a much shorter time horizon for financial planning.
Right.
You are far less likely to invest in long-term abstract goals like a 401k or a decade-long career trajectory because your early wiring violently insists that the future is simply not guaranteed. Why save for a future that might not exist?
And this translates directly into the modern corporate workplace. Childhood SES implicitly shapes an individual's deeply internalized beliefs about whose voice matters and who has a safety net if things don't go according to plan.
The data here is incredibly definitive. It shows a direct, undeniable link.
Mm-hmm.
The more financial security you had at age 10, the more likely you are to raise your hand, speak up in a meeting, and take a massive career risk at age 30.
The highest SES childhoods produce the highest scores in both interpersonal psychological safety and opportunity taking.
It creates an invisible psychological safety net.
Yes, if you come from high childhood SES, your internalized frame of reference, the blueprint you absorbed, tells you that failure is simply a learning moment.
Right. You can volunteer for the risky, high-profile project because psychologically you implicitly believe a soft landing exists. You have luxury of failing.
Exactly. But if you come from low childhood SES, your frame of reference tells you that failure is a catastrophic, unrecoverable loss. The stakes of the exact same corporate project are perceived entirely differently by two different nervous systems.
Let me genuinely push back on this, though.
Go ahead.
Is corporate success basically just a delayed reflection of your parents' zip code and bank account? Does this SES advantage ever wear off? Or are you just riding the momentum of your childhood all the way to the executive suite while everyone else is terrified of getting fired?
It's a fair question. The gradient does exist, and it is powerful, but it is not entirely permanent.
Okay, good.
The research clearly notes that this SES advantage in risk-taking and psychological safety is most pronounced in the early stages of a career, specifically under age 35.
Oh, okay.
As individuals from lower SES backgrounds gain professional experience, build their own undeniable competence, and secure actual tenure and financial stability in their fields, the gradient gradually declines. The adult does build their own modern safety net eventually.
Okay, that is somewhat reassuring. But the fact that your childhood dictates the first decade of your professional life, the exact decade where the exponential compounding of career growth usually happens, is still a massive deterministic force.
It absolutely is.
The invisible hand of childhood SES dictates our relationship with money, risk, and ambition. But there are other forms of profound cultural socialization that dictate the very core of our societal identity, right? Our gender and our faith.
Yes, this moves us into the realm of sociocultural and gendered imprinting. And it is critical as we explore this to maintain a strictly neutral analytical lens.
Definitely.
We are not making value judgments on the constructs themselves. We are examining the mechanisms of how profound cultural constructs are imposed from birth and eventually accepted by the developing child as absolute, unquestionable truth.
Exactly. We're just reporting the scientific findings on how this identity architecture is built. Let's start with gender socialization.
Yeah.
The researchers describe it as a massive ripple effect that begins literally the moment a newborn is wrapped in a pink or blue blanket in the hospital.
From infancy, parents interact fundamentally differently with sons and daughters, and this is almost entirely subconscious.
Subconscious.
Right. The observational research shows parents tend to play more roughly and encourage physical risk-taking with boys, while they comfort girls much more quickly when they cry and encourage quieter, cooperative play.
By the time they hit age 5, these children have fully internalized these gender stereotypes, which then violently shapes their resource allocation, their hobbies, and their social interactions.
And the ripple effect across the entire human lifespan is incredibly measurable. We see it clearly propagate into education.
Right. By high school, educational segregation becomes starkly prominent. Girls, having been socialized toward caregiving and communication, enroll heavily in fields traditionally deemed suitable for women, such as education, health, and the arts.
Conversely, men, socialized toward risk and mechanical thinking, heavily dominate information and communication technology and engineering.
Which then flows directly into the adult labor market, where women find themselves overrepresented in lower-paying service sectors and vastly underrepresented in high-risk entrepreneurship.
And perhaps the most striking data point is on domestic labor.
Yeah, this one was eye-opening.
The sources state that regardless of modern employment status, even if the woman is the primary breadwinner, women spend twice as much time as men on unpaid domestic chores and childcare.
And that stark division of labor is not a coincidence.
Yeah.
It mirrors the exact distribution of chores they observed and internalized in their childhood homes.
Exactly. The external live structure of the adult household is an almost direct, unquestioned reflection of the internal blueprint drafted in their youth.
We see an incredibly similar imprinting process with religious identity, too. The statistics on adult religious retention are striking.
Very sticky.
Approximately 56% of U.S. adults still identify with the exact specific religion in which they were raised.
And when we break down the nuances by specific faith groups, the sheer stickiness of childhood socialization becomes even more apparent. For Hindus and Muslims, the retention rate from childhood to adulthood is a staggering 99%,
Wow.
driven largely by deeply intertwined cultural ties and familial teachings. For Christians, generally, it's 83%.
And then we see some shifts in the modern landscape.
Hmm.
For U.S. Catholics, the retention rate drops to 57%. And for the LDS Church, the sources note a drop from 70% retention in 2007 down to 54% currently.
Right. But the crucial mechanism driving these numbers, the deciding factor of whether people stay in their childhood faith or leave, is what the data calls the positive experience filter.
The positive experience filter.
Yes. The retention rates are consistently remarkably high across the board for individuals who report having a mostly positive childhood experience with their religion. It becomes a foundational, comforting structure of community and meaning.
However, the inverse is equally powerful and predictive.
It is.
Right, 69% of those who report having a mostly negative childhood experience with religion no longer identify with any faith whatsoever as adults.
They don't just switch to a different denomination, they leave organized religion entirely.
And this massive ideological choice is typically completely solidified by age 30.
What this data demonstrates is that for the vast majority of the population, adult spirituality is rarely a purely independent, de novo philosophical conclusion reached through detached study.
Right.
It is largely either a direct, comforting continuation of, or a violent, direct rebellion against their childhood programming. The childhood experience sets the heavy anchor. The adult simply decides how far from that anchor they want to drift.
Think about your own defining traits for a second. Just ask yourself, how much of what you consider to be fundamentally, uniquely you, your intense hobbies, the way you pray or don't pray, your daily morning routines, the career risks you are willing to take, how much of that is actually an original adult thought versus a script handed to you before you could even read a book?
It is a staggering amount of invisible programming running in the background. It is a humbling realization.
Truly, we have painted a picture thus far of childhood as an all-powerful, heavily deterministic force that dictates our physical brain biology, our emotional regulation, our intimate attachments, our financial reflexes, and our deepest cultural identity.
We have.
But I feel like we have to step back and ask a meta question here.
Okay, what is it?
Has childhood always carried this much psychological weight? Or did we, as a society, invent the concept of childhood as a separate, highly deterministic phase of life?
This introduces a fascinating, slightly disruptive historical context to our exploration.
Yeah.
The debate over this hypothesis requires us to consider whether the strict child-adult binary is a biological constant across all of human history, or if it's a relatively recent, culturally fabricated social construct.
The document brings up Philippe Ariès, a highly influential French historian. He famously proposed a radical idea, that the idea of childhood simply did not exist in medieval society.
It's a very controversial take, but very interesting.
Right. He says children weren't viewed as these fragile, innocent vessels of future potential that needed to be protected. They were viewed simply as little adults.
Little adult.
As soon as they survived the perilous years of infancy and could physically function without a wet nurse, say, around age 7 they mingled freely in the adult world. They worked the fields, they poured drinks in taverns, they socialized, and they faced the exact same brutal realities as a 40-year-old.
Now, modern historians have criticized Ariès somewhat for having a narrow methodology and heavily neglecting the nuances of class differences. I mean, wealthy children certainly had different lives than peasant children.
Sure, of course.
However, the academic consensus generally agrees with his broader underlying point. The modern concept of childhood as a distinct, heavily protected, sacred phase of life defined primarily by education, play, and innocence is a relatively recent invention.
It only really began to emerge and solidify around the 17th century.
Yes.
So what culturally shifted in the 1600s to create childhood as we know it today?
Several converging societal factors. First, the widespread rise of formalized education. Teachers and institutions began dividing students into distinct age groups, which physically and socially demarcated life stages.
Before that, you just learned a trade from whoever was around, regardless of age.
Exactly. Second, the establishment of chronological age laws. Modern states began creating specific, arbitrary legal ages for adulthood, marriage, military service, and work, which legally manufactured the child category.
And third, the shift to the child-centered family.
Right.
The welfare, formal education, and moral development of the child suddenly became a primary societal and familial focus, rather than just treating the child as extra hands for economic survival.
Yeah.
We socially constructed this heavily protected bubble.
And what is genuinely fascinating is how this social construction continues to rapidly evolve. In contemporary society, sociologists are observing a massive blurring of the boundaries between childhood and adulthood once again.
Creating an entirely new developmental phase, often referred to as emerging adulthood.
Yes, emerging adulthood.
This is a phase lasting well into the late 20s or even early 30s. It is characterized by vastly delayed financial independence and the heavy postponement of traditional markers of adulthood like marriage, having children, and home ownership.
It's a totally new landscape.
It's like we are watching a massive accordion effect. We extended childhood biologically millions of years ago with neoteny, so we could grow bigger brains.
Right.
But socially, we tried to rush it for centuries, treating 7-year-olds as little adult farmhands. Now it seems like we are culturally catching up to our biology, stretching childhood independency well into our 30s, because the modern social and economic environment is just as overwhelmingly complex to navigate as the ancestral physical environment was.
That is an excellent synthesis of the timeline. But this brings us directly to the ultimate friction point of the document.
Let's hear it.
If we are biologically designed to be incredibly unfinished, and we are socially extending our developmental dependent period longer than ever before in history, does that mean we are permanently, hopelessly trapped by whatever flawed programming we received during that massive window?
Are we just prisoners of the blueprint? If the foundation is cracked, is the house just doomed to collapse?
The answer lies in the exact same biology that made us vulnerable in the first place: plasticity. Plasticity. This counters the overwhelming deterministic weight of everything we've discussed so far. We must introduce adult agency and the profound potential for transformative unlearning.
While our early outcomes are undeniably substantial, the bleak hypothesis that we are purely fending for ourselves children is partially disproven by the lifelong capacity for neuroplasticity. We are not just passive, tragic products of our upbringing. We are active agents fundamentally capable of rewriting our own code.
For a long time, the scientific belief was that the adult brain was a fixed, static organ. Once you hit 25, the concrete was dry.
But advancements in neuroimaging have entirely dismantled that, right?
Entirely. We now deeply understand structural neuroplasticity. This refers to the actual physical changes in the shape, size, and electrical connectivity of neurons in response to new adult experiences and intentional learning.
The brain is essentially a muscle that can be physically resculpted. And the document highlights clinical interventions that leverage this exact mechanism to heal from even the most toxic, terrifying early stress. Things like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT, and EMDR eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
EMDR is a profound, almost miraculous example of structural neuroplasticity in action.
How does it actually work?
It has been shown through brain imaging to physically weaken the heavily entrenched fear memory connections stored in the amygdala.
Oh,
It allows adult patients to decouple the factual narrative memory of a traumatic childhood event from the visceral, overwhelming physiological distress that was hardwired into them when they were young.
so they retain the memory of what happened, but their body no longer reacts as if the threat is happening right now.
Exactly. The physiological alarm is finally turned off.
And the broad data supports this resilience beautifully. Research shows that 2/3 of people who experience severe childhood adversity somehow maintain moderate to high mental well-being in adulthood. Adversity does not mathematically have to determine your entire life trajectory. We can unlearn the trauma.
But unlearning isn't solely about clinical severe trauma. It's about our everyday, mundane assumptions. This brings us to the work of Jack Mezirow, who developed transformative learning theory.
Transformative learning theory.
It explains the mechanical steps of how adults consciously unlearn what he calls problematic frames of reference, the deep sets of assumptions, expectations, and biases acquired during our youth.
He outlines 10 phases of change. This is essentially the practical instruction manual for rewriting your childhood software. I want to walk through these mechanics because they are incredibly empowering, and we've all been through them without realizing it.
Let's walk through them.
It almost always starts with phase 1, the disorienting dilemma. A crisis, a painful divorce, a sudden job loss, a massive personal failure that completely shatters your current worldview. Your childhood blueprint suddenly fails to protect you.
That failure forces phase 2, self-examination. You critically, painfully assess your own role in the dilemma, often accompanied by deep feelings of shame or guilt.
Which naturally leads to phase 3, the assessment of assumptions. This is the critical turning point moment where you finally question the validity of the fundamental beliefs you were handed as a child. You ask, is this actually true, or is this just what my parents taught me to survive?
Say you're going through a career change. You hit phase 4. Shared experience, you recognize you aren't the only person who feels trapped by their path.
Then phase 5, exploration of new roles. You start investigating alternative ways of being, maybe researching a totally different industry.
Which requires phase 6, planning action. You design a tangible course for a new self.
Phase 7 is acquiring skills, gaining the actual practical knowledge needed to implement this new plan. Going back to school, taking a course.
Then you put it into practice. Phase 8 is trying new roles, experimenting with these new behaviors in a provisional, safe way.
Phase 9 is building competence, mastering those new skills, and gaining deep self-confidence in your adult agency.
And finally, phase 10, reintegration. You incorporate this entirely new, self-authored perspective seamlessly into your daily life.
The blueprint is overwritten.
Overwritten entirely.
So neoteny is really a magnificent double-edged sword. It made us incredibly vulnerable as kids, leaving us utterly at the mercy of our environment, our nutrition, and our parents' flaws.
Right.
But it's the exact same biological mechanism, that endless retention of youthful plasticity, that lets us completely rewrite our brain's source code at age 40 or 50 or 80.
It's like we're handed a heavy clay sculpture at age 18.
Yeah.
It's mostly formed. It definitely looks like a person, but the clay never actually dries. You can always wet it and reshape it.
That is the perfect synthesis of the duality of the human life course. And it brings us fully back to the central hypothesis we started with today.
Let's answer it definitively.
Are human adults essentially just children who have learned to fend for themselves?
The deep analysis of the research suggests that the hypothesis is biologically and foundationally correct, but it is fundamentally wonderfully incomplete.
Incomplete. I like that.
It is correct in the sense that our biology, our neurobiological stress responses, our deeply wired attachment templates, our socioeconomic risk appetites, and our cultural identities are profoundly, unavoidably scaffolded in our youth. The outcomes of childhood undeniably provide the absolute baseline of our existence.
But it is incomplete because the act of adulting is not just fending for oneself based on old, outdated training. We are not just blindly executing a static script.
No, we aren't.
The very biology that makes us unfinished at birth ensures we permanently remain unfinished in adulthood. The architecture of the adult life is a dynamic, continuous process of construction, painful reconstruction, and intentional unlearning.
We are uniquely equipped with the cognitive tools to ruthlessly interrogate our own upbringing. The outcomes of childhood are merely the starting raw materials.
Adult agency is the profound ability to look at that material and consciously decide what to keep, what to remodel, and what to tear down entirely.
It's an incredibly empowering realization.
You are not just the house. You are the architect. Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your day. If our brains genuinely remain incredibly plastic throughout our entire lives, and this period of emerging adulthood is stretching further and further into our lifespan, perhaps our entire societal structure is completely outdated.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. If you are biologically capable of massive, epical shifts in your worldview, your career, and your habits at age 50 or 60, why do we front-load all of our formal education, all of our deep identity formation, strictly into the first 2 decades of life?
That's a great question.
Imagine a society where you take a mandatory state-sponsored unlearning and reprogramming sabbatical at age 40.
A dedicated time to rebuild.
Exactly. A structured, protected time to intentionally tear down and rebuild your psychological architecture for the second half of a 100-year life. What specific childhood beliefs would you unlearn? What new foundation would you pour?
That is something to think about.
Thank you so much for joining us for Today in the Hypothesis.
Thanks for having me.
If this deep dive into the source material shifted your frame of reference today, please be sure to subscribe to the show. And more importantly, share this examination with someone whose own architecture you find absolutely fascinating. Until next time, keep examining your blueprint.